YAC lecture series, we welcome PeterPoulet, who is the government architect of the New South Wales, which is in Australia. Actually, it's a pity that Matilda is not here with us. She would be so excited. And okay, we have some other Australian here taking over. And he's going to present his role as state architect, government architect, which is something that is a figure that the most of country doesn't have. And so he's going to explain us which is this role and which is the sense of imagining a country like a project. We will talk about the initiative they've been doing in the state, in Australia, and this capability that the architects have to think transcalarity and to apply the design thinking to problem solving of different natures. So I think it's going to be very open-eyes lecture, very inspiring for us. So we know that you have a presentation tomorrow, but this is it's going to be very nice for you to give 1 hour of focus to this lecture. Okay, guys? So you help me welcome PeterPoulet. Stage is yours.
I've come from Australia, so I'm a little tired. So if you don't mind, I will sit tonight. Yes, the government architect of New South Wales. The word architect is a strange thing because I actually don't practice architecture any longer. I practice politics and creative thinking. And the word creative is very important there because that was taught to me in architecture school a long time ago, and I'm not going to tell you how long. Nevertheless, I started life as a traditional design architect back in the I'm here now. And I wanted to tell you a bit about myself. I did do some design work. I've worked in Japan. I worked for Toyo Ito for a while. Sejima was there. It was an interesting time. So that gives you a time frame of when I was there. And one project of mine that I think might be relevant still, and it's an old project done in 1995 maybe, which was dreaming about a house of the future. And at that time in 95, I don't think we had computers even. Maybe we did. But we envisaged a house made totally out of pre-made concrete product, out of concrete pipes and concrete slabs, and a house that had a green roof and stored its own water and made its own energy. And we had an exemplar of this house actually constructed. It was a lot of fun, so I wanted you to understand that design is still an ethos or a core to the sort of thinking that I will be presenting, and I haven't lost sight of that, despite the fact that I'm now a bureaucrat in government. This is the interior of the space that we created. Very difficult to hang paintings on curved walls, I found out later. Nevertheless, it was a pleasant space, it was a cool space, people had fun in it, and it was a way of opening people's thinking that architecture is more than, well, has a future, has a vision about the future that it might be very different to the present. I'm the 23rd New South Wales government architect. New South Wales has had government architects consistently for 200 years. And that's a unique position that has traditionally been a traditional position, I think, a position that's been making buildings for various reasons, and the role has been replicated around Australia, in every state of Australia. And we meet regularly and have very secret business meetings, particularly over dinners and lunches. But we talk about issues that are of the time and are affecting the profession and the understanding of architecture and how government intersects with an industry and a profession to make the future. And that's what we're about. We're making the future as architects. We're always future thinking, optimistic, people who are still wishing the best for the world. I will now step back from that and talk about a uniquely Australian proposition, our Indigenous past, because Australia and the government architect, New South Wales and the government architect that I am, only represents 200 years of colonial history. The British came to Australia 200 years ago and assumed that there was no one there, and yet that was a lie. There was a 40,000-year-old culture there that could have and is now beginning to inform how people think, but particularly how people think about the future. And architects, as I said earlier, are people who are imagining that future and making that future. And I think that's very important to note. So our Indigenous past is starting to inform how we relate to our place. This is an interesting map of Australia. It shows all the Aboriginal nations that existed when the British came. It's an astounding map because there were many different cultural groups that intersected and made Australia a whole. And it didn't and doesn't adhere to the maps that the British or the colonials drew. This is New South Wales, only a small piece of Australia. Still, with many Aboriginal nations there, with different languages, different cultural methods, but they all intersected to make a nation that was sustainable and actually quite rich in cultural terms. So when the British arrived, the landscape had been tended, and they assumed that it hadn't. The landscape had been burnt, had been controlled to allow for the Indigenous people to hunt easily, to gather easily, and to understand the topography of their land, and that all helped them lead a sustainable life. And I think that's something that we all strive for in our lives now. The work that you're doing here, and I've only just seen a little bit of it this afternoon or this evening, is exactly about that. How we are going to make a future that is going to survive and isn't going to actually damage or take more than it gives. There's a fantastic legacy of creativity and thinking. The Aboriginal culture didn't need to invent abstract art, they had it within their souls. And I think it's important to note that the sophistication that people now find very attractive in Aboriginal art is something that was there 40,000 years ago. That's the fascinating thing. And so we, as architects and myself in government, are understanding our place, our recent arrival in our place, in deeper terms, and we're relying on our Indigenous population to help us gain that understanding. So a cultural understanding that springs from these amazing people who have built or who have made these amazing artworks. So I'm not talking loud enough, I can tell. Yes, the colonial past that I spoke of. The British arrived in wooden boats, decided that there was nobody else here, and started making a colonial European style place. It happened to be based around bringing a lot of convicts who had done fairly minor things in the mother country as a way of deportation. So they were the first boat people that arrived in Australia. They didn't understand the place, they didn't understand the landscape, they didn't understand the flora, they didn't understand the fauna, and in fact they almost starved in the early years because they didn't understand how or what to make of where they had come. And yet, as I said, 40,000 years of a rich, deep culture that was sustainable and sustaining to the people that were here. Many spiritual stories sprang from that time. I'm not going to pretend that I know them because I'm only a colonial myself. But yes, the early colony, with its ships and its taking down the landscape, taking down the trees and and wiping out the topography with grids and what have you, was not the way to treat a very delicate landscape, a very delicate land. And we're only now picking up on that, and some of the work that we are doing about Sydney's growth is exactly that. It's understanding that cultural background that we're lucky to have, and that cultural background and how it relates to the land on which it was developed. So some early European paintings about the noble savages, as we called them. Astounding that they all just reclined in a splendid Eden, as did the Europeans, but dressed slightly differently. And you might notice that they are always set near the harbour or near water, with sandstone or cliffs of stone of some sort nearby. And that leads to the next interesting observation, that Sydney is built, and I come from Sydney, and most of the work of the government architect is currently being focused on Sydney because Sydney is growing. Sydney is made of sandstone. And that gives us, again, a unique understanding of the place and the material that is there. It's not always what we've used. We've used all those international products that come on our shores in big ships, but our early understanding of the place was needing to use what was local. And again, the materials that you're making in the Fab Lab here use zero carbon because they come from where you're making. And that's the amazing thing about what the original colonial people did. They used the sandstone. They used a material that was already there to make some amazing things. To carve sandstone very beautifully has given us a legacy in Sydney of fantastic buildings. And that material has a warmth, a naturalness, and a localness that is very worth understanding. And many of these buildings were built by previous government architects. As I said earlier, I'm the 23rd, but other government architects did some amazing things and actually built the colony as we know it. And they built those items of colonial power that we all identify with, starting with hospitals, leading to schools, leading to police stations, courthouses, and ultimately jails. That's what we were famous for. We did a few cultural buildings too. This happens to be it's an art school, but it started life as a jail. And again, built of sandstone, a material that is viscerally connected with us as people because it's natural, and with the place that it's come from. It was quarried there on the spot virtually. So again, some of our forefathers, whatever they were, understood place better than we have in recent times. And it's interesting that the work that you're doing here, as I said, returns to that understanding. Fantastic sandstone. I get pretty excited about it. And the warmth of that material. Not showing you anything you haven't seen before. But there was this colonial history and this colonial understanding and this understanding that we had to be more European than the Europeans. And so we built cities that reflected our heritage, reflected our past, reflected our understanding of what it was to be a civilising community. Government architects played a big role in that because at the time there was not a developed industry in Australia, not a developed profession of architecture. And so the very first government architect was actually a convict who was deported, exported, whatever the term is, to Australia because he had forged some documents in Britain and was seen as a troublemaker, and so he came to Australia as a convict. Interestingly enough, the government of the time decided that they didn't need architects or creative thinkers. They thought they could do things on their own. And so the first hospital that was built in Sydney was built by a private consortium. And this plays to the role of the government architect. A private consortium that was commissioned to build the hospital and were paid in the contract to serve rum to the colony. And so we had a very drunk colony that had a very shoddy hospital. And when the first governor or Governor Macquarie, not the first governor, came to see the hospital and found that it was not of good standard and was going to fall down, he called upon the first government architect, Francis Greenaway, to come and give him a condition report. All those old things that still have to happen in architecture. And it was understood that there were no footings and the building would have fallen down, except for the fact that this condition report suggested that remedial action needed to be taken. And so the first government architect was put into place. Somebody who would ensure that the right standard of building, the right sort of building, occurred for the community of the time. And that has continued for 200 years, and that work continues in my work, but in a very different guise. So the government architect built lots of stuff. This is one of our historic buildings in the centre. And we've got a litany, and this year we celebrated the 200th year, as I said, of the role, with an exhibition in the State Library, which was built by the government architect of the time. So our landscape, I mentioned our landscape has been important and something that had been denied for many, many years because we could do anything with a bulldozer and enough effort. And yet that is unique to our place and very special to our place. And our landscape talks to the river valleys, the flooded valleys that actually make Sydney unique. Sydney has a fantastic topography and a fantastic creek and river system that really makes our place special. That's not all of New South Wales. It's a photograph of Greater Sydney, stretching with all those bays and inlets and making very unique small pocket communities that have their own sense of self, and that's something that again needs to be amplified to make Sydney a better place. That's the Sydney CBD, and you can see the overlaying of the grids and how they don't quite work with the topography, how we've been in denial about our foreshore in some places, and how this is where the first people arrived in New South Wales. And the notion that we're surrounded by green space and, as I said, these creek systems and natural systems that have been denied for 200 years, and yet they were there and understood by our Indigenous people. And so what my office is doing at the moment in working with the Department of Planning is to place that understanding in the development of district plans and the development of Sydney, because Sydney will be growing to the tune of another 2.1 million people in the next 20 to 30 years. So Sydney is going to change significantly, and what does that change mean? What will inform that change? And I'd like to think it will be the geomorphology, the landscape, the Indigenous heritage of the place that will make it uniquely of the place and uniquely special. And what's interesting is we've been doing mapping in the office, a significant amount of mapping around the agricultural lands, the recreational lands, the ecological grid, the river systems and the natural habitat paths, and the hydrological systems. They have all been mapped by our office and overlaid with one another to help determine fairly unique development patterns. So the development springs from the place that it's going to happen. When we do this overlaying, it's an amazing grid that we get, and we're developing this grid to then further inform what we're calling the green grid. So we're then amplifying those river systems, those river patterns, those creek systems, and using landscape as a manner of amplifying them to make for a better city, and a city which is going to be more than just one place. It's going to be a polycentric city or a polycentric metropolis, And I've shown you the Sydney that we know, the harbour city with the iconic Opera House and that fantastic harbour. But we've got other places in Sydney that are less well known. Parramatta, the river city as I call it, and the Western Sydney, the Parkland city, where the 2 million people will be predominantly housed. We're building a new airport out there, we're building new metro lines out there. It's going to transform Sydney to a fairly major metropolis of over 6 million people. And if you look at this map, the different grids, the different interfaces that it shows, from the denial of our water courses, denial of our hydrology, to a more open development pattern in the centre there, to then a very natural system still available to that future parkland city that I described. That future parkland city is also going to look at different typologies of housing and of building, because we can't be replicating the same thing that we've done to date. Why not? Because it's not sustainable. And these are some details. This shows the interface very clearly. The typical suburban grid on that side, the looser grid that's still paying homage to a past that was unsustainable, and then the natural systems, the natural catchment areas described in Badgerys Creek and South Creek, where we'll be putting airports and metros and those sorts of things. How do we not lose sight of our nature, of our past, of our understanding of where we come from? As I mentioned earlier, the hydrological grid, and that is so informative of Sydney and New South Wales, because we are water poor. We don't have a lot of rainfall, and so water is very precious, and yet we've been denying that very fact. The ecological grid, the green grid as we're calling it. And this is an amazing photograph, because our forefathers foresaw Sydney as a big city and yet surrounded it with national parks and green infrastructure, as I'm calling it, to put it in the terms of those engineers who see landscape as a soft thing. And how that permeates the city, how it informs that city, how it links the various small pieces of green, natural space that is important for the future well-being of our population. Recreational grid. We've got fantastic parks and amenity. How do we make more of those? How do we link those things through a thought through and well researched and interrogated series of connectivities and connections? The green grid, as I said, has become part of the metropolitan plan that has just been developed, which will then go into district plans and ensure that we are building more green space, and yet we're also building more housing and more built space as well. It seems a contradiction, but it will inform where it's appropriate to put that development. I mentioned the three cities with the overlay over that. And it's interesting to look at it historically, where the 19th and 20th century were really focused around the harbour. And it's only after the Second World War, the post-war era, that we started developing west. And yet that is where Sydney's population centre is currently, and it's only moving further west. And so how do we make sure that the amenity and the quality of life that we enjoy in the east is replicated and amplified in the west? How do we make sure that the people that live there are going to be as happy to live there as we are along the harbour foreshore? These are interesting conversations that we're having, not just in government, but with the local councils, the local communities. And what's fantastic is that the profession and the industry are part of that debate. So that's the role of a government architect in the 21st century, to bring all those people, all those voices together, to make sure that what we do is appropriate to the people that it's going to serve. The three cities of Sydney, as I said earlier, the Parkland and the West has got a fantastic potential, and we don't want to lose that. It's got rivers, it's got great natural systems that we're only going to be amplifying. And the harbour city I spoke about, it's on all the postcards. I don't need to tell you too much more about it. And this is what we're looking at, the suburbia in the middle, what we're calling the missing middle. What does it mean? What sort of life is that there? How appropriate is it to the 21st century? And as I said, with the population growth that we're anticipating, and it's already starting to happen, the focus has been on really extreme development, putting it simply. We've been building fairly high buildings, 20, 30-storey high apartment buildings, more like more like other cities than what is typically Sydney. And that's been a counterpoint to the suburban city, as I call it, that is seen here, a city that's really a series of individual houses with gardens around it. The missing middle, as I call it, is something that we're offering up as an alternative. Probably similar to what you see in Barcelona, those 6 to 8 storey buildings that are somewhere in between the towers and the suburban house. And what's interesting about the conversation is people are, and this is I'm talking about communities, are very keen to have that conversation because they are keen to see choice available to them. Both choice in the type of housing, choice in price point, and choice in connectivity to other services. So it's something that my office is developing as we speak. I should be there doing it. We're very keen to make sure that when we develop in the urban areas, we develop the potential to have a happy and active lifestyle, because health and the well-being of communities is based on access to green space, access to active transport, access to those amenities which are both physically good for us but also mentally stimulating and worthwhile. Places like this, where we've kept natural features available to all and just helped with minor interventions, and this is quite old now, to make these available to people. The fact that infrastructure is being built as well is significant for architects, because the infrastructure has traditionally not had a design focused, it's had a efficiency dividend focus. And so we in our office are intersecting with transport and with infrastructure providers to make sure that how it's provided, where it's provided, amplifies amenity as much as connectivity. And that's pretty exciting for architects who have not traditionally worked in that space. I mentioned earlier the increased access to open space, and this is to the west of Sydney, where there is no harbour, and yet what a fantastic amenity, what a fantastic place. Gaining access to that, making sure we don't lose that, is an imperative. So what do government architects do? We are the facilitators, we are the go-between, we are the synthesizers of all that information, of all those groups of people that don't naturally come together. And this is a unique role for people both in government and yet not part of government. We are expected to be independent in our thinking, honest in our appraisal, and fearless in our advice that we give to our political leaders. We intersect with community, with academia, with the industry, and with the profession. And so we are very supported by those groups as well, because they see the value in the connectivity that hasn't previously existed. Because for 200 years the government architect have been like any other architect, building buildings, designing and building buildings, admittedly public buildings. But that time has passed, and it's been my role predominantly this year to make that transformation from an office that has done what other good professionals do and designed good, intelligent, useful and joyful buildings, to a group of people now that encourage the profession to do that and to innovate, but help achieve that by bridging the gaps that exist within our society generally, between government and all those other organisations that I've talked about. That's a very important role, and it's a role that has happened I think in Barcelona almost intuitively, because there's an intelligence here that allows for that to happen. But in a colony, that hasn't been an easy thing. And so in this day and age, I guess I'm moving our office away from the traditional model I described to more like a model that a city architect in Barcelona would have. Somebody who facilitates good work, who is the curator of good work, who is the protector and the shepherder of good works. Aimed at the future, obviously. So the office that I described has waxed and waned over the years. It's been quite large, it's been quite small, it's been influential, it's been non-influential. I'm really a very small office in comparison to the 1,500 people that were there in the 60s and 70s. I'm an office now of 8, looking to be 12 by Christmas, but never any larger than probably 20 or so. But a different skill set and a different focus than what the 1,500 were doing behind drawing boards with graph paper and pencils and pens. That era has passed, as we know. We have much more connectivity to government and to the decision makers, the agencies that build, and we have great connectivity to particularly academia. And I'm very happy to be here today because I'm hoping that this will continue in the future. A connectivity with IAC and someone in New South Wales, me maybe, because I think you are doing very good work here in redefining the future of architecture, the future of the architect. And it's a very ancient word, I think, but I think it's a skill set based in a tradition that is now able to expand your thinking and expand what you do, because the world has become far more open, complex, dynamic, and we're all very networked. And I think that's fascinating because we can't stick to the siloed thinking that has driven, I think, our society to date. And so my role is to be the networker, the connector of complex issues and bringing many people to bear on solutions. So we need to be far more open and far more able to grasp ideas and in fact develop those ideas. So look, I'm not going to go through my method of design thinking, but it looks at what I call archaeology and the investigative period of time, identifying paradoxes and conflicts and contradictions in what we find, understanding context, and developing what I call a problem arena, which is where we play, the sandpit. And from that elicits themes and consistencies that are agreed to by all or understood by all as being imperative. And from that we reframe the issues or the problems or the project or whatever we're looking at in a way that foresees a future that wouldn't otherwise have been foreseen. And that's a transformative act. And it makes for better connections. It's insistent on making connections that previously didn't exist. And I've actually run through this process when I've reformed or transformed my office from being that traditional office to being an office that does the sort of things I've talked about. And we've done that over this year through a program of works called GA 200 Plus, Government Architect for the next 200 years. Although I think I'll be dead by then. Having said that was a joke, by the way. Having said that, we've investigated with a number of groups of people a number of issues that I thought, or that we as an office thought, were important to investigate. And primarily what the driver behind those questions was, what is it to be the government architect or to have a government architect in the 21st century? And I think that's important to note, that it's been confirmed by the various groups that we've spoken to that it is a role that's important. And I think it's a role that is only going to grow in stature, and there's going to be a growing need for the sort of people that help with the intersections, help with the connections, and help with the future envisaging that otherwise the typical business model doesn't address. So we talked about things like, what is great design? How are we going to be living? What's Sydney about? how do we innovate in practice, and there's been some other historical elements. We're very keen to start using data and measurement and an understanding of performance to determine the decisions that we do make in the future. Architects have been very bad at that, understanding whether what they've done has been good or bad, other than in purely formal or stylistic terms. We need to talk in performative terms, we need to talk in human terms. Are people happy with what we're doing, and are people happy with how the world is changing, because we are changing the world. Transformation, what an appropriate time. So I've used the methods of design thinking, as I've said, to really look at issues in a different way, to actually want to find problems, want to find contradictions and conflicts, and interrogate a future through lenses of how do we address those things. So it's been an iterative process, a design process. It's what you do here every day. It's a process of iterating, testing, trialling, and I'm talking in not only in physical terms, but in terms of policy, or in terms of thinking, or in terms of how government can organise itself better to deliver better for a community. So what you're doing here happens to have physical manifestation, but it's equally applicable to systems and to the way people organise themselves. And that's the exciting thing about design, because you as design professionals have those skills innately in your DNA, because you've been trained in that way. And I think that's an exciting future for you as you go forward. You have such a wide world to go into, and I just happen to have chosen a very strange governmental interstitial space, which is actually very important. It's not for everyone, but it's equally creative. And for a creative to be helping government be creative is fairly unusual, certainly in Australia. So design thinking has been the methodology. We know the paradigm. Previously, it's been the people with the money driving what they want, and design and social concerns have been something at the end of the line. We want to reinvent that, we want to reverse that, and we want to use design and social concerns and social delivery as the drivers for decision making and the methods for decision making. I think that's really important, because we are building communities, we're making new societies, I guess, and that's the exciting thing if we can include those people that will inherit that in the conversation. It's intergenerational as well, I should note. It's not just old blokes like me making these conversations, it's us making the space for others to come and be part of the conversation. So it's intergenerational, and that's important to note as well, because you will be inheriting what you make now, not me. And we all know it's important to get in early. It's important to make sure that design thinking, the creative thinking, the decision making around what it is that we're doing is made early, not at the end. I don't care what colour it is. I'm more important about to make sure that it is a colour. And look, I'm going to quote Saarinen here. Always design a thing by considering its next large context. So a chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. And that's exactly, I've gravitated up the tree, I've climbed up the tree to the point where an architect is now talking about city planning, an architect is now talking about organisational change and using design methods, architectural methods, to make that as best as it can be. We're not unique in Australia in doing that. The Danes have got it, the Scots have got it, and many others have. The Scottish have got it, sorry. I'm talking whiskey. And I think that's a good thing, because that's been our first piece of action. In the 11 months that I've been in this transformation role, action is what counts, and you only have a short time for action before other things sweep you away, or could sweep you away. So our first project has been a document which really nails our opinion to the mast, as the saying goes, puts the line in the sand, gives us a platform to say, Design is important, architecture is important, and it can drive a better place. And I'm very heartened to say our politicians have understood the value in this, because there's probably votes in this. But they've been very supportive of our better placed policy. And it's a policy really that's out to achieve great design in everything we do, not just in architecture. But it starts with architecture, because architects are trained in design processes to achieve good things. Oh, well, there it is, towards great design. So that's our Sydney icon, what defines Australia in many ways, the Sydney Opera House. And so the policy fits not just in architecture, not just in urban design, not just about in object design, it fits more universally, because what it unpacks in the first instance is what I'd describe as the what is design, the givens that design can be ascribed, and they are relatively universal or immutable or difficult to contradict. And they are what I'll read to you this, the understanding that it's important when you're doing design, when you're doing good work, to be understanding where that work and the context in which that work has been undertaken. It can be a physical thing in building a building. It can be a structural change in policy or organisational places. You still need to understand the context in which you're working. It needs to be a sustainable thing. What you do needs to be for the long haul. It needs to be something that is not going to be undone. So it needs to have durability. It needs to be for a long time. It needs to be for everyone. It needs to be as equitable and inclusive as possible, because we're all equal on this planet. Enjoyable, safe and comfortable. I can't say why would you do otherwise. Functional, responsive, all those things, fit for purpose. That's a baseline for architecture generally. Value creating, cost effective. We're still ruled by the economists to some extent, certainly in New South Wales. And it's important to note that it needs to have some joy. It needs to be visually appealing, distinctive. It needs to be something that's special, something that's precious. So those things are, I guess, the methods we then, the principles that we apply when we interrogate anything that we do. And in the first instance, we've looked at, I guess, 3 scales or through 3 focus areas, and it's been specific around city making and architecture. So it's about cities and towns. It's about the public spaces that we make, and it's about the buildings we make. But clearly in the future, as we move on, we're going to be looking at other things, and transport being one, because it's always been problematic. It's about the green spaces that I've talked about. It's going to be about many, many things. So we will build these focus areas over time, but they will all be interrogated, they will all be reviewed, they will all be looked at through those 7 lenses of principles. And in each case, there will be different outcomes, and there will be different ways of looking at these focus areas, because they are unique in themselves. And different outcomes, different ways of interrogating them. So in the first instance, urban design and architecture for cities and towns, they will be looked at through those 7 lenses. Sorry, 7 principles. But what we find and how we assess what we find will be very different in each case. The urban realm will be looked at differently again, as will buildings and what have you. And this is slightly fuzzy, but it's okay. Sydney, as I said, is growing. It's been recognised by our government as being an issue that is problematic as well as an opportunity. And what I want to share with you is that our minister has gone and said, he doesn't want to be like Shanghai, he wants to be like Barcelona. And I think, well, that's a good thing. When the politicians recognise a good thing, we should help them achieve it. And so, as I talked about earlier, this notion of a missing middle, this notion of we've got towers, we've got houses, What happens in between? What are the typologies that are going to rule our future? What are the typologies that we need to develop in Sydney that are available internationally, but need to be grounded in the place, grounded in the geology, the landscape, all those things I talked about, the cultural history, the 40,000-year-old cultural history of Sydney. What's going to make that a unique proposition and something that's going to be interesting to design? And that's what we're calling the missing middle. So in the first instance, we've produced another document called the Missing Middle, oddly enough, where we try to define what that is in many ways. And we're now running a design competition for Australian, not only architects, designers, students, anyone, to come up with an understanding of what that is and how that might be made in the future. And that's just opened, and I'll show you some links to all that later in the presentation so that you can take those down. But it's a way of using design thinking, using design people to envisage a future that doesn't exist yet. It's not me as the government architect of 200 years ago saying this is how it will be. It's the government architect saying we are open to suggestion, we are making the landscape for people to come and play in, for people to come and design in, for people to have a voice in. That's called, and that's using a design competition in this instance, but we have other methods. So as I said, we've got houses and we've got tower blocks. What's in the middle? We've also been undertaking some interesting work, and I'm calling that strategic speculations, because I think that's our role. We're speculators about our future. And that's specific in this instance to that western part of Sydney that has been not really looked after because we've all lived in the east. And so Parramatta specifically, and this is a map for many of you who don't know where Parramatta is, it's at the end of the river. And although the portion of Sydney on the harbour there that is famous and where the colony started, Parramatta was really what fed Sydney for a long time. That's where the agriculture started, that's where the useful land was. And so it has an ancient history too in colonial terms as well as in Indigenous terms. And so it becomes really the epicentre of the future of Sydney. And how do we develop around that, and what do we develop around that is the question. Excuse me. And so we've done some speculative work specifically around that city centre to make it something that it's not currently. We've looked at main streets, public spaces, all those things that make up a rich and vibrant city. And that's been done not just by our office, but we've facilitated a series. I think there's been 12 different architectural firms really doing propositions for this place, for small projects in this place, which are catalytic projects. And they're actually being undertaken by the local council in a way to catalyse a future, to catalyse a creative thinking group of people in that community. And that's really working at the moment, specifically around green spaces, but equally around street activation, around densities, around heights of buildings, around sun access, all those things that we as architects do well, but we now are engaging with communities to deliver. And specifically, oh, well, there it is, water flow, topography, connections of people. And that all comes to delivering civic places, river squares, a city that is actually more than it has been for a long time. So it's the future of Sydney. There's more drawings of it. And I'm starting to repeat myself, I think. Strategic frameworks has been a piece of work that built on that speculative work, because Parramatta was where the majority of the growth will happen. And we realised that there were half a dozen government agencies all spending millions and millions of dollars in Parramatta with no understanding of what anybody else was doing. And so there was a conflict there potentially that was needing to be uncovered or unpacked. So we undertook a piece of work for the infrastructure body of government, called a strategic framework, which had which has no authority, but it certainly garnered all the information in one place for the first time. That sounds very naive, but it was astounding that it hadn't happened. Major projects in Parramatta, many major projects happening as we speak. Cited here, I think there are 15 or more there, 16. From new museums to new cultural centres to new railway stations to new metros to new light rails, they're all there. A Powerhouse Museum, Cultural Precinct, Riverside Theatres, riverbanks, it's all there. I don't need to go to the detail. New schools in old buildings, new sports stadia, new parks. An amazing amount of effort being put into a place and no coordination. Sorry. And so our job was to understand the structure of the place, to understand where it's appropriate to make things or not make things, what was important about the place. All those methods that I talked about earlier applied to Parramatta. And that now has been through Cabinet and has become a document that is really deciding whether things are happening the right way or the wrong way, in the right place or the wrong place, and are being coordinated. So it was, again, the government architect's role as being somebody who brings together what hasn't been brought together before. And the criteria to judge whether things are good and bad, really based on those 7 criteria I spoke about earlier, but specific to this place. So the resilience, the vibrancy, the respectfulness, the connectivity, the inclusiveness, those are all things that I talked about before, but applied to this specific place. And those principles then inform the decision making into the future. I mentioned that I'd put up some links, and I'll be leaving this here, so you'll be able to get it later. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm not finished. You need to see some buildings, and we're famous for the Opera House. We're famous for some interesting modernism. We've got some iconic structures. We continue building that stuff. Modernism was a wonderful thing that had some level of purity in New South Wales. We've done some postmodern stuff as well. We've started really looking at our heritage buildings and our old industrial buildings, which is nothing new to you guys. We've started building precincts and precinct plans around getting the sort of densities that are coming whether we like it or not, and some very favourable press around what's a very dense precinct and lots of people here, to, you know, the boutique-y little bits of architecture that still excite some. The big institutions, the big universities have been investing seriously. We've all got our Frank Gehrys, all a way of marketing ourselves to a wider audience, particularly internationally. We've got our Shigura bands. We've got our sustainability office buildings, which are naturally ventilated or mixed mode, trying to do the right things, trying to not to be taking more than they're giving, and I think that's an important lesson. But ultimately, we're all moving to the country. The sandstone is still there. We haven't mined at all for our buildings. And the fact that with that connectivity to the place, that understanding that living softly and with a very small footprint is the appropriate future model is where our office is certainly putting our focus, despite the fact that we're growing, and we're growing in a more resilient way. I'm really keen to take some questions rather than boring you with a monologue. Is that okay? There you go, end of slideshow. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. So let's see if we can take a couple of questions. I'm very excited, very cool. Later.
Hello, Peter. I worked in Australasia for 4 years as an engineer, and I lived in Sydney as well, so I know Sydney pretty well. One thing that strikes you when you're there is the lack of culture, I guess, and not to say it in a harsh way, but when you get into living in Australia, you can realize a rich, very rich history of Aboriginal culture. And you're talking about the beginning about the Aboriginal culture. I'm wondering, are you considering public interventions as they do here in IAC, as active public spaces they do here? Have you considered public interventions which are specifically drawn to Aboriginal culture as a way to integrate the culture back in?
I think that's only one part of it. I think it's an important part because it has that history, and we do have exactly that occurring now. Specifically in the Sydney CBD, we've got the there's a group of Aboriginals that are looking at old understanding of place and exhibiting that in their own way somehow, so that is occurring, and that's giving a more deep understanding of place. But with that fairly significant European overlay, it's at times an interesting rub point, I guess. What I should have said also is Sydney is full of very, very many nations. There's hundreds of nationalities in Sydney. Yeah. So again, this monoculture, which I think has been probably Anglo-Saxon, is diminishing, and what my role is to make sure that the voices that are there are part of making that culture of the future. And I focused on the Aboriginal one because I happen to have an Aboriginal architect in my team, and he is part of that process, and I think that's a good thing. It's a rare thing, but we need all the voices to have an equal say in building that culture in a way that is demonstrable. Yes, you're right. A truly international city has a depth of culture, and Sydney is not as deep as it should be, putting it simply.
Another thing would be the transport links between cities.
Yeah, between cities.
Well, between Sydney itself, Parramatta, the new cities you're proposing,
yep.
The mountain city, I guess, the river city. There's a lot of congestion, I guess, in Sydney from the desire to live in the most beautiful city in the world. Yeah. So have you reconsidered the high-speed rail, I guess? Have you considered strongly the links between these cities to integrate these cities?
It's all on the agenda. Sydney, within its metropolis, is building currently 2 metros, some light rail lines. It's still doing roads as well, which is unfortunate. But the metro, I think, is the solution for the metropolitan part of Sydney. The fast train is an interesting thing because I'm party to a project which is allowing for it to occur. It's not funded currently, but certainly linking, well, the thought was always Brisbane through to Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne, but that's the entire eastern coast of Australia. Mm-hmm. And there's a short-term opportunity to do Newcastle, Sydney, Canberra as well. And it's missing Wollongong, admittedly. But Wollongong is likely to become the logistics centre with a dedicated freight line to Western Sydney, to where the international new airport's going, and then a very fast train or a metro line, fast metro line from that new airport to the existing airport, mm-hmm. So through the CBD, through Parramatta, linking those cities that I mentioned. That's the aspiration. It's on the table. It's drawn.
Thank you.
Hi. To what extent does your office or your design strategy of a new urban environment approach self-sufficiency, whether it is on the scale of the city itself or the neighborhood or even the house?
We aspire to achieve that, and yet we aren't as influential as we should be, or can be, or could be, and so there's still fairly stock standard development occurring on the fringes of things. There are exemplar projects that are being developed, which hopefully will lead the way. We have a thing called, well, we've got Green Star and all that, but specifically to New South Wales, we've got a thing called Basics, which looks at certain performance criteria around housing. We've also got a thing called the State Environment Planning Policy 65. I'm glad I remembered. Which talks about the amenity of specifically apartment dwellings, access to natural light, access to ventilation, so you don't need to air condition, access to deep soil planting, access to transport, those sorts of issues as tradable elements when a development is assessed. So it's on the agenda, but it's not reaching, zero sustainable impact yet, but it's on the way. And the idea is you put those criteria in place and ratchet them up over time to achieve those goals. So yes, that's the pragmatic governmental side of things, where we're at least laying the foundation for improvement, if that makes sense, and then using exemplar projects, design competitions, design excellence provisions to ensure that every time there's a notch up. It's a long-term strategy. Yeah. I'm proud to say we've signed up to the Paris Accord finally. Or Australia has, which isn't very much. It's something.
Any other questions? Sí, Fira?
Hello. I would first would like to know what's the age group of the decision makers in Sydney and Australia, in a way, because I think that's more important than strategic talking. And the next thing is getting from strategic to more tactical. And how can you involve the academia and the universities in what you do? Because I didn't really get it.
Yeah, the age profile, I don't think it's unusual. It's probably too many old white men, putting it simply. But what I'm hoping to do is put processes in place which allow for other voices in the conversation. And the methods for linkage, specifically to academia, but also with the profession, are around having internships in the office, are about sponsoring, some research and innovation work in the institutions themselves, specifically for the benefit of government around the built environment. So those methods are starting to happen now. The design competition is an aspect of that, but not specifically aimed at academia. It's aimed more broadly. And there's an interest to have our role more interactive. So I'm an adjunct at a particular institution. Others in my group are adjuncts elsewhere, and so we have roles in the organisations that help deliver the new thinking and the new generational thinking that hopefully will come into government. And the internships and the notion of having a churn through the office of young people, I hope to seed the profession with people who have had some experience dealing with that strange world that I inhabit. And so they then go back to the profession and have an understanding of how to broach government, how to work with government, how to work across disciplines and across agencies.
Hello. I just wanted to find out, to ask you if you've worked with any sort of informal sector in Australia, for example, a region that's probably not been developed, and what impact you might have in that kind of setting.
Yeah, look, traditionally we work for government and for agencies. However, interestingly enough, most recently with we've had an Aboriginal design unit who have worked directly to communities, which has been fascinating because government hasn't delivered what they need. Right. And so they've gone, my architects have gone directly to work with those Indigenous communities to develop not only the built forms, but the programs of of interaction
Right.
that help for better outcomes. And it's been specifically around misbehaviour of youth and those sorts of issues, driving without licences, silly things. But that direct hands-on approach is something that we have the capability to do, but not necessarily the capacity because we're small.
Right. Just a follow-up question, because in that situation, you would find the policies would be more impactful, no, rather than even the design. You would have to bring in a lot of policies to change and to control or organize that kind of sector. How does your office have a sort of precedence for that sort of thing, or?
Well, we started by setting policies around design and architecture, but certainly that would translate to policies in other fields. I'm loath to say policies that are directive. I'm keen to develop documents which are expansive in their potential, and so people can use those documents to then develop in a way that we can't foresee. We can't be prescriptive, and so policy is sometimes seen as narrow, particularly in government. It has connotations, and so we're talking about guidelines, we're talking about manuals, we're talking about ways of working to develop something. We're not being prescriptive about outcome. I think that's what you're wanting to hear.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See? Any further question? No? All right, so hopefully in some years, some of you is going to happen to be a state architect in his, her country. Hopefully so. So we leave it here tonight. Please help me thank again PeterPoulet, and let's go having a cava together. Thank you.